Thanks everybody for coming. Thanks Steve for organising and inviting me to be here. And thanks to Wholesale Investor for supporting innovation in Australia. It's something that I'm very passionate about. It's a tough act to follow going after Steve, and I'll have a disclaimer out front. I have a 4-month-old baby who's going through one hell of a sleep regression, so I apologise in advance if I'm not as peppy as our host. So moving through actually the real disclaimer, a message from our lawyers. So what Steve asked me to speak about was the healthcare innovation bull market. And so I'm not going to come here and lie to your faces. We are in no stretch of the imagination in anything close to a healthcare bull market in today's market. The market started to collapse globally, probably in 2021, in Australia in 2022, and we have not seen a recovery. But what I want to talk about is, I guess, why the market only matters when you're buying, or if you're a company, when you're looking to do a fundraise. But the actual commercial outcomes, the market is less important to healthcare than it is to other sectors. And so these are the kind of 4 points that I'm looking to cover. Why Australia and New Zealand? And a lot of people, when I pitch my fund in Australia to investors, particularly in the US, they say, why would I care about Australia? Why am I looking to come to Australia? The US is the locus, the epicenter of healthcare innovation. And while that is true, a lot of important innovation comes out of Australia, and we'll meet some great companies today and tomorrow. Why now? Going back about what I was saying about the market, obviously why healthcare, and then look into the future. So on why now, as we were discussing earlier, we're in a deep bear market in healthcare. What we're looking at here is what we can ascertain from publicly listed companies in the US going back to when the market really started to collapse, which was April 2021 for biotech companies. We've seen it go down, we've seen it stay down, and the data's a bit old, but if you were to fast forward to today, we saw a slight recovery towards the end of last year, and on November the 5th, I believe it was, we saw that kind of really fall off. But as Warren Buffett says, be fearful when others are greedy and greedy when others are fearful. Healthcare, unlike other industries, if you use tech as an example, with healthcare, you don't actually take very much business model risk. And what I mean by that is the price of a drug in particular is very forecastable when the drug is even in its infancy. You can look at what other drugs are on the market, you can look at where they're priced, and based on that, you can have an estimation of what you think the clinical benefit of your drug would be, and have a good idea of what price will be. That price and that price elasticity is very low, right? What we've seen through cycles, going back to the 20s in the US, is that while insurance is linked to employment, we actually don't see insurance rates really vary that much when through cycles. And the one time we did see insurance vary a lot was when Obamacare came in and we saw it go up. And so with that, demand is largely unaffected by market conditions. And if you look at CSL in 2008, when everyone thought that the demand for their products would fall because they're super high priced rare disease drugs, and that if people lost their insurance, they would no longer be able to afford those drugs, we did not see that happen, right? We saw the demand and the sales growth stay flat. On the margins and cost side, the margins for a drug in particular, we know that well before the drug goes on the market. So the manufacturing package, the CMC package, is audited by the FDA very early on in the clinical development piece. And so we actually know the unit economics of a drug maybe a decade before it goes onto the market. So what that means for an investor is you can actually forecast what the business model and the profitability of that drug or the drug or device will be way before you have to worry about it getting onto the market. So what is the real risk? It's the clinical risk, right? Will the drug succeed, or the medical device succeed, or get regulatory approval? And you compare that with tech, right? If you're an early investor in Uber or an early investor in Netflix, you really don't have much insight into what that business model will look like when the company is at scale, right? Who are your competitors? You don't know. What are the pricing power? No one really knew, and right? If you fast forward to today, Uber just became profitable. Netflix is accounting profitable. And so if you're an early investor, your ability to forecast a P&L in tech company, and any other company really, is not the same degree of certainty as healthcare. So the crucial skill when looking at a healthcare company in early stage is your ability to assess the clinical risk, which is largely idiosyncratic. And if I'm to show you an example of that, an Aussie example, Neuron. So prior to starting Carspeak, I was the head of healthcare prior to starting KPRX, I was the head of healthcare at Carspeak Capital. Carspeak were the largest investor in Neuron. So we acquired our initial investment in March 2020, taking 14% of that business. So if you look at that share price chart, right, you can see where we invested again. The first uplift is the FDA, is the phase 3 trial being positive. That's in just before 2022. The next uplift is FDA approval. The next uplift is when the pricing is announced and the drug is commercially launched. And if you have that against the backdrop of what the market did, right, we saw a 40% decline in the XBI. So I guess the key point that I'm trying to make to everybody in this audience is, with healthcare, don't be too concerned about what the market is doing, except when you enter. And so the opportunity present in the market right now, I think is at least, I mean, I'm not too old, but it's been the best time to invest in healthcare I've seen in my career, right? Particularly in the private side. The venture capital funds in Australia are few. Private investors have largely left the market. Generalist investors have kind of really left the market. The companies that exist in healthcare, unlike tech companies, healthcare companies can't pause their funding, right? So healthcare companies, if a clinical trial costs $10 million today, it's going to cost $10 million in 2 years' time. If you pause that, all that means is your patent clock is ticking and your business is becoming less valuable. So a healthcare company has much more of an onus to raise today at a lower valuation than maybe a tech company that can maybe mark time, do things cheaper, maybe, cut down their go-to-market plan, but a healthcare company can't. A clinical trial value is set. Same with a MedTech and same with a diagnostics company. And so we really think now is the time to be investing in healthcare. And as a vintage of VC funds, if you go back and do an analysis of the best performing healthcare vintages, the ones that launched in 2000 weren't the best ones, right? Because we had quite a steep crash in 2021, 2022. But the ones that launched in 2007, 2008 did quite well. And so I think the healthcare funds that are launching 2 years ago to today, and then maybe in 2 years in the future, will do really well. One caveat that I will put, we have some serious near-term regulatory uncertainty that we've never seen before. And this regulatory uncertainty is across the board. So the first thing I'll talk about is what's happening to the US has been the locus, the focal point of healthcare innovation for forever. The cuts that are being done to the NIH, BARDA, other government bodies means that I think there is a potential that we'll see the center of gravity of healthcare innovation potentially move out of the US to somewhere else. Where that'll be, we don't know, most likely China. And so that could be that could actually change what the eventual economics might mean for biotech doing research today, where in the past the US was a market of choice, but in the future, in 10 to 20 years, might not be. On the other side of it is the ability to get a drug or device approved. We're seeing ad hoc cuts at the FDA across the departments with really no rhyme or reason. One of our portfolio companies has an application with the FDA at the moment. The person that was running that application is no longer with the FDA, and the last I heard over the weekend was he might be getting hired back. So there is that material uncertainty. So what does that mean for me as a fund manager? With my companies, I need to make sure that they're funded to weather this initial storm, be it 1 or 2 years, where we might see some dislocation before the regulatory landscape is more known. Now that's easier said than done in a particularly tough market. And so all that means is we're being a lot more picky with our positions, making sure that they are funded, and less likely to we're more likely to be more concentrated than to be not in this market. Why Australia and New Zealand? So this is the number one question I get whenever I leave Australian shores to talk to LPs outside of Australia. What most people don't realize is Australia is actually the market of choice for conducting early stage clinical research by everybody. Pfizer, Lilly, everybody will come to Australia to do early stage clinical research. The biggest reason for that is our R&D incentive. 43.5 cents on the dollar back in cash. And so when I meet US LPs and I tell them that the federal taxpayer is paying for 43.5% of the risk capital of my portfolio company, they think that's crazy, right? Like the US was very generous with grants, but nothing like this. So what that means for me is if a company needs $10 million to do a clinical trial, I only have to really fund them 6.5, 7 mil. The federal taxpayer will do the rest. But on the other side of it as well is that it's a lot cheaper to run a clinical trial in Australia than anywhere else in the world. But we have an ethnically diverse population that means that we can recruit the required patients to mirror the US and to mirror Europe. So I'm sure clinical trials can be done cheaper in some other markets in Asia, maybe Africa, but they tend to be a very kind of homogeneous population. On the other side of it, on that same point, a CT scan in Australia is about $100, $200. It's about $2,000 in the US. An MRI is about $500 in Australia. It's in the many thousands in the US. So the actual conduct of the clinical trial is a lot cheaper in Australia. And so on a kind of a purchasing power basis, an Australian company needs to raise 10, 20% of the money that a US company needs to raise to do the same level of work. So a company in Australia can stay in Australia, raise money in Australia, do all their work in Australia all the way up to the end of phase 2, and then not have to worry about going to the US until after then. So what that means, particularly for a cell therapy company, Leslie will be speaking later, right? The CMC package that you need to give to the FDA before you can even dose a human sometimes costs tens of millions of dollars. So as an investor, as a VC, that is, it's not wasted money, but it doesn't de-risk your investment. So you have to spend tens of millions of dollars to do manufacturing and certain types of toxicology work that doesn't de-risk or improve your value, but you've got to pay for it before you actually do the stuff that will improve your value. In Australia, you don't have to do that. And that is very attractive. And so all of these kind of regulatory changes has meant that we've become the market of choice. And because of that, we have the best clinical trial infrastructure in the world. There is no market better than Australia to do clinical trial research. New Zealand is a close second. And so what this has meant is that biotech and MedTech has become one of the fastest growing sectors in Australia. So I've kept food and ag there as a kind of a control, but we've seen more than doubling of the amount of people hired within these sectors, and government incentives go up with that. And now we have the government even further supporting it with diluted money. So you have the National Reconstruction Fund, you have Breakthrough Victoria in Victoria, Invest Vic, all supporting innovative companies, and they have a big sleeve for healthcare. So what does the future hold? One thing that I think generalists don't appreciate as much as, I guess, people that have worked in the biotech industry is that big pharma don't really do they do some of their own innovation, but the vast majority of the innovation that gets done, all the life-saving drugs that go into patients' arms, are done by small companies all around the world, mostly Australia and some mostly US, some in Australia. And when you look at that pie chart, you can see that only 28% of the drugs that were blockbusters were developed by big pharma. Everything else was acquired. And Steve talked about dry powder or spare capacity in the market. Big pharma now have more capacity, cash and available debt to acquire every single medium and small cap pharma in the world. So they've never had more dry powder today than they've had in the past. So we've seen a pause in M&A activity over 2020, 2021. We saw it recovering in 2024, and then kind of abruptly stopped with the regulatory uncertainty. But big pharma need to acquire. Their products are on a patent clock, right? So they buy a drug, they launch the drug, 10, 15, 20 years, that drug goes off patent and the revenue goes to zero. So they need to constantly replenish that pipeline, which is why we're always looking to big pharma as a potential exit. The IPO window is still largely shut. 2024, we saw kind of a slight creak opening of the IPO window. The best IPO to date has been CG Oncology, which has traded many multiples up from its IPO price. But unfortunately, that's kind of firmly shut in the last couple of months. But I always tell people, unless you believe that people are never going to get sick again, there's going to be a healthcare market and the IPO window will open. So what am I excited about in Australia in the near future? So we published an article recently in Livewire saying that Australian biotech is no longer just CSL. So when I started my career in the investment side 5 years ago, there was only just CSL as a profitable biotech company in Australia. There was no other ones. Fast forward to today, we've got Telix and Neuron. Fast forward maybe another year, and then so we have a couple more MedTechs. Fast forward a year in the future, EBR Systems might have their FDA approval and might be a very profitable MedTech company. We've got PolyNovo, we've got Avida. None of those companies were profitable 5 years ago. So we're seeing rapid growth in a very short period of time in Australia. And I think that the next 5 years, independent of what the market will do, will be just as exciting. Thank you.